In this video, we're going to test the find all users with confirmed email address method. And instead of creating a new web service endpoint and updating my REST controller and creating a new service layer, I will create a new test case to test this method. So to do that, I will go to my source test Java and I'll create a new test case, new JUnit test case. I'm going to use JUnit 5 and we'll choose new JUnit Jupyter test. As the name of the class, I will provide user repository test. The rest here I will leave untouched, except I will put this new test into a new package. So that's going to be IO and then repository, like this. And I'll click on finish. Alright, so we have a new JUnit 5 test, and for this JUnit test to be able to communicate with the database, to read data or update data, it needs to be an integration test. When we run this JUnit test, it will need to bring up the environment and make Spring context available to us so that we can auto-wire beans and we can use those beans to work with the property files or a database. So to make this JUnit 5 an integration test, we will need to use add extend with annotation, and inside of this extend with annotation we will need to provide Spring extension class, like this. Let me import extend with and a Spring extension. And one more annotation to make it a Spring Boot test. I will add Spring Boot test. And let's import this one as well. Okay, so we have one method here which will fail if we run it. Let's remove fail and let's rename it to something like test get verified users. And because this test is going to test user repository, we will need to import user repository. So I will import it right here and I will auto-wire it. Let's import auto-wired. Alright, so now we need to use this user repository to call this method find all users with confirmed email address. So I can use it this way, user repository find all users with confirmed email address, and it takes pageable request. And now we'll need to create pageable request, and it goes like this. Pageable request equals page request, and then we'll need to provide a page that we want to start with. Let's start with page 0 and then the number of items that we want to return per page and save it. Let's import pageable, and it has to come from org Spring Framework data domain. And find all users with confirmed email address returns page user entity. So let's take it and paste here. Pages equals like this. Okay, and we can now immediately assert that our pages object is not null. So we will use assert not null and use pages here. Okay, so if we run this code now, we will not get any results because this is a JUnit test and we are using in-memory database. And because our database is still empty, when I run it, there will be no records. So for this to work, we will need to create at least one record. And I will do this in my setup method. I will create user entity and then I will persist this user entity in my database. So I will bring in a little code snippet. And basically what I do here, I create a new user entity object. I put in some hard-coded details, but one important detail here is that email verification status I set to true right away. So I assume that this user has already verified their email address, and my method find all users with confirmed email address should be able to return at least one record that has this value set to true. Now, because user entity uses addresses, I will need to also create an address record. So let me bring in a little code snippet and paste it here. So I'm creating an address record. Let me import address entity. Let me import list. and array list. Okay, and now when I have addresses, I will use user entity to set addresses, and I will use this addresses object. Oh, okay, it's already there. Okay, so we have a user entity that has one address in the list, and now we will need to save this user entity into a database. We will use user repository, and we will use method save to save this user entity. Okay, so now if we run this code, there should be at least one record in the database, and this method find all users should be able to return at least one record. So let's assert that there is at least one record, and I'll bring in a little code snippet that does exactly that. So we will have our pages. From the pages object, we can get content, and that content will be already list of user entities. Now we will then assert that this list is not null, and we will assert that this list contains at least one record. Okay, so let's run this unit test and see how it works. I will do right mouse click, run as JUnit test. And here we go, we got back a green bar, which means that JUnit test is successful, and we got back expected result. Let's now fail it. And to fail it, all I need to do is to set this set email verification value to false. And now if I run this JUnit test, it will insert into a database one record with the email verification status set to false. But my JUnit test is expecting that there will be at least one record. So this assertion will fail. And if it does fail, then we know that our find all users with confirmed email address is working, because when we run it the first time, it did return us one record. And if we run it the second time, now with this value set to false, it should not return any records. So let's try it. And JUnit test failed. Okay, so that's working. Let's change it back to true, and let's add more records into our database. Let's add at least one record so that we can test pagination. So what I'm going to do, I will copy all of this and I will paste it below here. And that will be my user entity 2. And I will replace all of this with user entity 2. I will change the user ID because user ID needs to be unique. And that will be my address entity 2. I will change all of it to address entity 2. And I'll also change the address ID to a different value. Now on my list of addresses will be 2. It will save 2, and it will take address entity 2 and user entity 2 set addresses 2, and I will save my user entity one more time. So this code saves one user, and this code saves another user record. Okay, so now we should have two records in our database, and both records have email verification status set to true, so we need to update this assertion to 2. Okay, so we're calling our find all users with confirmed email address method, which should return 2 records. Let's run this now. It has failed. Let's look up why it has failed. And this is because when we save here on this line, we save user entity instead of user entity 2. So I will save user entity 2 and I will run this code one more time. Okay, so the bar is green, it works. Now we know that there are 2 records in the database, and we create a pagination request for exactly 2 records. Now let's try pagination and request only 1 record per page. So now we should get a 1 page with only 1 record on it, And this should actually be page rather than pages. It will make more sense. So now we will have one page with one record on it, and we should assert for one record only. Let's run this and see if it works. And here we go. We have a green bar. We can also try updating this to the next page. Our second page will also have only one record. So let's try this one. And it also works. Okay, so our select native query works, and we can continue.